Now, when you go online to look up stuff about environmentalism between the left and right, it's all kind of lame. It's boring. Some right winger will tell you how most environmental frameworks were historically created by right wingers. And that's true. I mean, if your average sort of far left college student sat down and talked with Teddy Roosevelt, they'd walk away swearing he was a fascist or something. Some left-winger will tell you about how there's a right-wing political party that have been parroting lines meant to protect entrenched oil and coal companies against some renewable power option. And you know what? He might be right. But keep in mind, a lot of left-wing political parties and organizations have been repeating anti-nuclear slogans, which protected those same oil and coal companies for decades. These left-wingers will tout the need to reduce carbon emissions and reduce air pollution, but won't recognize one of the reasons France is so far below many other of the wealthiest countries in carbon emissions is because they're supermajority nuclear, over 70% nuclear. If you've ever heard the phrase, electric cars are coal-powered cars, well, in France, those are nuclear cars. Nuclear power is a lot like airplanes. When it goes wrong, it's a big deal. Plane crashes are flashy. They catch attention, just like nuclear problems. And an endless amount of articles from NASA isn't going to change some people's perception of nuclear power or flying. And some heavily left-controlled countries, like Germany, are actually phasing out nuclear power, which is a damn shame. Some people have pushed hard to make nuclear a bad word. They didn't stigmatize fission, unfortunately at least, although fission is very safe. So even when Elon Musk and Sam Altman get on stage to talk about humanity's future, and they just start discussing nuclear power and the need or the potential for nuclear fusion, the New York Times journalist Andrew Sorkin has to jump in and ask,
what about the risks of nuclear energy?
Of fusion?
Of fusion? Yeah, I assume there's some risk. There's no risk?
Not really.
Zero? I'm an idiot? I don't...
No.
And of course they're both flabbergasted because they weren't expecting to have to explain what nuclear fusion is to a journalist. But all that stuff, who did what, who's an idiot, the stuff that people talk about with environmentalism, the history, it's all presented in a totally disconnected, boring way. And what do you really learn from it? Nothing. You walk away from the conversation thinking, oh yeah, my side is the good guys. We do the good things and the other side's dumb. Lame. I'm here to tell you, there is a fundamentally different approach to left-wing and right-wing environmentalism. Just as a note, I'm going to be talking about full-fledged environmentalist views. I'm not talking about someone who heard the news that Miami could be underwater due to climate change, and now they're worried about their uncle, right? That's not an environmentalist view, that's just concern for your family. If someone you know is into the environment, they may or may not have a fully coherent view on environmental policy. Right? So they might not fully fit into a category perfectly. They might have contradicting ideas. Most people do. But they'll tend to lean into one of the two ways, right? So first, the left-wing approach. Left-wing approach is preservationism. Preservationism, at its core, is the view that the land, when not used by human, in its natural state, is really sort of best. Untouched deserts are wonderful, right? A forest that no human has ever seen is sort of a magical place. And to protect that land from human activity is the goal. That's what it means to preserve something. The view, preserved places are good, places that haven't been preserved are worse or bad. The cause of turning a place from good to bad is humans and all the stuff that we're going to do when we get there. The preservationist wants to protect the environment from people. Now, the preservationist, at its most logical extreme, is something you can find on Twitter and the like today. During the lockdown of the coronavirus, someone tweeted, "The Earth is recovering," and "Coronavirus is Earth's vaccine. We're the virus." None of this is new to today. There are all sorts of people who have expressed this over a long time. Humans are a miasma. Humans are a pestilence on the world. Anything that implies that we fundamentally harm the land with our presence is sort of the extreme version of this. Obviously, that means preservationists will be anti-hunting and anti-anything that involves interacting with and impacting the natural goodness that remains, right? So these preservationists would say they don't necessarily like cities because some area was harmed to build the city, but they probably live in one and they might advise that you live in one. Keeping people in urban centers, which are fairly dense living conditions, means that we're keeping people from spreading out into the more preserved areas. If these nature-destroying humans need to exist, let's at least keep them in contained urban environments so they're not spilling out and ruining everything everywhere all the time. So that's the left-wing sort of preservationist view. You might know someone who is in this view, or at least mostly in this view, if they agree with the core of it. Maybe they don't want to kick all humans out of all preserved environments, but, they genuinely view us as destructive. The right-wing approach is different. It's conservationism. A conservationist would say there are sort of two different ways to interact with an environment. There are ways that change it, and then there are ways that don't change it fundamentally, right? And conservation isn't about stopping all human activity. It's about minimizing or stopping activities that change it while maximizing activities that don't change it, because those activities are generally enriching in one way or another or healthy for humans. To explain it another way, the National Park Service says conservation seeks the proper use of nature, while preservation seeks protection of nature from use. So when you look at something like hunting, this is a good place to start because this is something conservationists support, but preservationists don't. Conservationists monitor an animal population. Given their study of that organism, they monitor to figure out what the total population is, where that population is living, and what is the carrying capacity of the land they're on. Now, carrying capacity of land refers to the maximum number of animals we could basically expect to be able to live there for a full year. So the carrying capacity is limited by the harshest season. So, for example, if you have 10,000 deer that are living in an area and it's currently summer, they might be living there now, but what if there's only enough forage and cover and all the things they need to get 7,500 deer through the winter? 7,500 is the carrying capacity of the land. 2,500 is the current sort of surplus. With that in mind, a conservationist may want to issue deer hunting licenses so that way people can go out and harvest those deer and bring that nutrition home to their family. And if you've heard about antibiotic-free, free-range, hormone-free, this is the best stuff out there, all right? Way better than anything you buy. So what they'll do is they'll issue enough licenses to bring that population down from 10,000 to 7,500, down to the carrying capacity. So if they know, for example, that about 60% of all hunting licenses issued to deer hunters in this area leads to a successful harvest, then they'll issue about 4,166 licenses, because that will result in the harvesting of about 2,500 deer. They'll also have all sorts of other factors calculated in as well. Let's say there are predators in the area, mountain lions that kill deer. They'll know how many mountain lions there are, how many they eat during the winter, blah, blah, blah. The goal of this type of system is to allow as many deer to be hunted as possible, not just in 1 year, but to allow as many deer as possible to be hunted over the next 100 years. You seek this sort of conservationist plan so that our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren get to hunt as much as possible in their lives, not just us. So I said that conservation is about minimizing activities that change things, but maximizing activities that don't change it. What doesn't change it is getting the license, paying into the system, and harvesting a deer in accordance with our monitoring and what our scientists determine. Something that does change it is going out after the season and poaching a deer when we're actually at or below carrying capacity now. And of course, when you sell these hunting licenses, these conservation programs fund themselves. You get to use that money to hire more great conservationists to collect data, understand conservation challenges better, as well as directly tackle ecological problems with that money. That money can be used to improve and expand on or protect, forage, or cover, or conservationists will sometimes use that money to, let's say, design and test new road structures that allow migratory animals to pass under them, and then they'll go to the governor or whoever and ask that they look at their proven design so hopefully it can become standard, that kind of stuff. This same sort of philosophy could really be applied to resource extraction from any natural resource. If you wanted to pull timber from a forest, how could you do it? Well, you'd want to think carefully on your plans that would allow for that. Because again, you're not just trying to pull out the most timber you can today, you're trying to make sure that your great-grandkids can pull out timber. If we accept that ecologies are complex things, the presence of healthy trees are tied to soil conditions, the conditions of waterways, rivers, and streams, the presence of healthy insects, fungus, and various animals are critical to the ecology, it does start to get quite complicated, but it is doable. And if it can be done, and it can be done in a way that doesn't sabotage the future generations, then it's not something that fundamentally changes the environment. We'll allow it. It's conservationism. Ultimately, when you look at the history of conservationism itself, there are some very large success stories. Here in the United States, elk used to live across the entire country, and they were completely eliminated from most of the eastern United States before conservation became a force in this country. That's why you'll often hear places called Elk Ridge or Elk Mountain or Elk River, even though there's no elk there. Well, they were named a long time ago, back when there was. On the screen in front of you, dark green, that's where elk live in large numbers today. Light green is where they used to live. So they used to live everywhere. Now, if we hadn't come in with conservation, there'd probably be none left, because that's what we were close to. Let's look at the numbers. The Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation says the number of elk dropped from 10 million to less than 100,000 by the year 1900. So over this last 100 years, we've multiplied that number by 10 or more, right? We're back up to about 1 million elk, and we're climbing. Also, elk has been reintroduced by conservationists to many states and Ontario. In 2016, an elk was spotted in South Carolina, the first time since the 1700s. Since this country was founded, we didn't have elk there. We saw one again for the first time just recently. Conservationists have worked very hard to reintroduce elk to places that they used to exist so that they can get established. Then maybe once they're stable, we could start hunting them again. That hunting revenue can help to establish a real place for them long term, that funding. Although we are running into some problems here in the United States with our conservation system, too many soy boys, not enough hunters. NPR has covered this problem, but so have many others. Hunters have historically been some of the main drivers for conservation efforts in the United States. They've paid money for licenses, which fund the entire system, but also have been some of the main leaders in conservation organizations. With a generation of young men who are less connected to the outdoors, less connected to traditions like fishing, hunting, tracking, trapping, and survival, a lot of these conservation efforts are suffering from a little bit less interest and less funding than if young men were still into this stuff as previous generations were. Teddy Roosevelt said, "In a civilized and cultivated country, wild animals only continue to exist at all when preserved by sportsmen. The excellent people who protect against all hunting and consider sportsmen enemies of wildlife are ignorant of the fact that in reality, the genuine sportsman is by all odds the most important factor in keeping the larger and more valuable wild creatures from total extermination." Now, he said the larger and more valuable, but search on YouTube for videos on things like Ducks Unlimited. Duck hunters save the duck, and they're not large. And this is really getting into sort of an argument on, like, why is conservation better than preservationism, right? So let's say you have a preserved forest. Well, what's keeping it preserved? Basically, like the moral outrage that people would have if you tried to develop it. What's keeping a conserved duck wetland preserved? Well, some people feed their families from that duck wetland. They have a genuine incentive to fight against it. If let's say we are using conservation methods to pull timber out of a forest, well, that land is actually productive. You're fighting not just moral outrage, and people will still have moral outrage, but you're also finding genuine incentives that people are using that land. Now, if we weren't having problems with young men melting into puddles of pure soy once they're exposed to sunlight, we may have made more progress with conservation and the reintroduction of animals, but they are still going well for now. That being said, they might start to get worse when a lot of the good old right-wing boys who are still supporting the system start to die off, because there's a big difference between the generations on this one. As our country changes demographically, this might start to go away. Now, someone can complain about hunting, especially if they loved the term trophy hunter as a slur. To them, it signifies some sort of terrible malice on part of the hunter. Here's the reality. If a man is hunting, let's say he's hunting an elk or something, if he's out there looking for the biggest, largest, most gnarled male, like, oh, I want to kill that, massive antlers, you could say, oh, what is he doing? What is he really hunting? Well, I'll tell you what he's really hunting. He's hunting a male that is probably one of the older males in the group and has passed on his genetic material multiple seasons. He might be so old he's not actively breeding anymore, depending on the animal. So if this male dies, the herd will not produce fewer offspring, and the herd won't be any smaller next season. Remember, the number of animals is going to come down to the carrying capacity whether we hunt them or not. And if he's hunting something like an African elephant, he's probably paid between like $30,000 and $50,000 for that hunting license. So not only is he making a huge financial contribution, which can be used for conservation efforts, which can be used to increase the elephant population in the future by improving their forage, their shelter, all that kind of stuff, but him and his guides, because let's face it, if you're hunting African elephants, I'm sure you are paying for guides. It's a rich guy thing. Him and his guides will produce a lot less ecological stress than the dozens and dozens and dozens of jeeps of tourists it would take those photo takers to pay out $50,000 for conservationism. Hunters, by their nature, generally can't be super loud, generally aren't smelly, generally aren't disruptive and destructive. You can't sneak up on a white-tailed deer by crashing through the forest. Here in the United States, the fees for animals are very reasonable. You're not dealing with elephants here. And, especially if you're butchering yourself, it's a lot cheaper per pound than at the grocery store. If you bring it to a butcher and you have them do a lot of really fancy things like smoked meats and cured things, okay, it might be different. But the fees are often pretty reasonable, and the funding is still enough to be very helpful, and the ecological stress of hunters is very low. Now, it's really hard to start to explain this to people, especially if they're against it. You explain to someone that elephant hunting doesn't impact elephant populations. They freak out. What the heck does that mean? You think I'm stupid? Of course killing animals reduces the population. People get pretty emotional. Ecology and wildlife management is not exactly simple topics, especially from a conservationist perspective. A lot of people don't necessarily want to sit through an understanding of what carrying capacity means. From a preservationist perspective, which is probably who you're talking to, it's a little bit more simple because it's like, humans get out, don't worry about it. Things will just get better if you freaking leave already. You're messing things up. Now, down in Africa, they do have problems with their conservation systems. That being said, most of those problems are mostly corruption. A corrupt preservation system is just as bad, possibly worse, because, they have less money coming in. So if only a fraction of money gets used for the correct thing, more money's still better. If underlying preservationism is environment good, humans bad, or environment creative, that which creates, humans destructive, that which destroys, well, what is underlying a lot of conservationism? Underlying conservationism, you generally have something like human good, environment enriching, or human not good until environment. That's right. The most extreme forms of conservationism often sort of tend to be something like experiencing these natural environments and engaging in traditional outdoor activities is fundamentally good for humans, and humans who aren't doing it are missing out. Many people adopt a conservationist view because underlying they value, either a little or a lot, primitivism. So as sophisticated as aquaculture-produced caviar is, maybe if you were to humbly stand on the riverbank with a hand line or a spear or even a modern rod and reel, trying to get a fish to bring it back and cook it, maybe that's better than the caviar. Maybe when you're trying to catch a fish, you're doing something that people have done forever. Maybe you're making a meaningful connection through the generations to something that can be considered genuinely human. It's not simply a contrivance of the modern day, like typing something onto social media to get another dopamine hit when someone pressed the like button. Ooh, me got a like. Me got 10 likes, me feel even better. For most people, they don't even think about the position of the sun or the direction of the wind. We're completely disconnected from that. Now, our ancestors thought about it a lot, especially if they were hunting. Those things matter. You are an animal and you have a smell even when you think you don't. And when you're hunting, you want the wind to be in your face, right? You want to be moving forward, animal smells being brought to you as you move forward, noises carried to you as you move forward, and your noises, your smells brought behind you. Now, do you want the sun to be shining in your face? Like it's a stage spotlight? Are you trying to put yourself on display, illuminate yourself for all the animals? No, you want it to be more like a flashlight hanging over your shoulder, illuminating your way as you go forward. When you're out doing that, when you're out thinking about those things, well, yes, in the modern day you're wearing a blaze orange hat. When you walk and you stalk and you think and you plan, when you see how that animal is heading up and is about to crest the ridge, and you're trying to figure out how you can get close enough without spooking it, and you're going to plan to maybe as it gets over the ridge and you're out of line of sight, you're going to run up to the ridge as fast as you can because you know there's a river on the other side of the ridge and the sound is going to drown out you running. So you're going to run and get up to that animal. You're doing something that has been done for thousands of years. You're doing something that's been done for thousands of generations. At the extreme end of conservationism, they might say that not only is this healthy and fun and something you should do, they might say, if you haven't done it, you've really missed out on part of being human. If human roots are hunting and gathering, and you've never hunted nor gathered, what are you doing? A lot of guys get into hunting and a lot of girls do get into gathering. It's always interesting to talk to the women who get into gathering. I'm not sure if you've met many of them, but, they talk about all sorts of things. They always know the local berries, local mushrooms, what you can't eat, pine needle tea. It's nice. It's very interesting when people get passionate about this. I don't do it. I'm colorblind. I'd probably pick you a poison berry, but, I leave that to them. When I was a little kid, I lived right next to some woods, and I'd go out into the woods, and I'd climb, and I'd crawl, and I'd swing, run, trip, fall, and eventually I'd come home, and one of my parents would find ticks on me, and they'd have to pick them off. And the more extreme sort of conservationist, the right-wing environmentalist perspective often comes out as, well, yes, I could have fallen, I could have met an aggressive animal, I could have gotten Lyme disease from a tick. Maybe those things and that risk was totally worth it. Maybe me running through the woods as a kid really was the healthiest thing I did. Maybe it was healthier and better than any computer game I played. So let's understand the preservationist and conservationist perspective a little bit more clearly. Take a look at this Thomas Cole painting. If you're just listening and not actually watching, just Google Thomas Cole at some point. Most of his paintings would work. As a preservationist, especially a strong preservationist, someone would look at the landscape of a Thomas Cole painting and say, look at the beauty of this place. We must never let it be spoiled by use or exploitation. It is a sacred place. We should make it off limits. A conservationist would say, hey, look at this place. You could bring your kids here every summer, or you could visit every fall. You could take in the beauty. This would be an amazing place for your kids to learn to appreciate this, and you could teach them how to respect and to maintain this land. Now, if you're going to the more extreme of conservationism, which is often has some sort of underlying primitivist view, they might say, hey, you should live here. Dig out the smallest, most modest hobbit hole, just what you need, nothing more. You should want your children to be born in this. You should want to protect it. You should want it to remain wonderful as it is now, so that way you can be buried here. A preservationist would likely tell you, hey, don't knock down that forest to build a strip mall. We need to preserve that forest. Just leave it alone. A conservationist would tell you, don't knock down that forest to build a strip mall. We use that forest. I feed my children from that forest. We camp there. We love that forest. It enriches our lives. A preservationist is likely to tell you how 24 hours a day city lights disrupt insects and birds. And it does. A conservationist, with their more sort of human-centric view of the world, is likely to tell you how city lights shining 24 hours a day disrupt human circadian rhythm and sleep cycles. And you know what? They're right. A more extreme conservationist, this sort of underlying primitive view, might tell you how city lights shining 24 hours a day have prevented some city-dwelling humans from seeing the night sky like our ancestors did. In 1994, a 6.7 magnitude earthquake took out the power in LA. People looked up at the sky at 4 a.m. and they saw a sort of silvery cloud thing. Some of them called the Griffith Observatory to ask what they had seen, because, for the first time, they were able to get a visual understanding of our galaxy. They saw the Milky Way for the first time in their life. To not even be able to see the stars and get a feel for our place in the galaxy, as everyone before us has, it's kind of a shame. All right, I better at least touch on the climate change issue. Leftist environmentalists dominate the media, so it's only natural that all conversations about climate change is done in a super accusatory way, like, darn you humans, you ruin everything, because, environment good, humans bad, that's the left. And while the media portrays this as an issue that only the left is concerned about, that's not quite true. I mean, if you really start to go to conservation and agricultural things on this, there's even USDA sort of streams where they'll talk to farmers and ranchers. A lot of very right-wing people are very concerned about this. It's just, the media and the way we talk about politics is totally disconnected from real life. But here's the deal. Let's say we had a dictator of Earth, and he was a conservationist, not just sort of a vague position like right-leaning, a real environmentalist conservationist. If his science advisor came to him and said, sir, the climate is in some way changing, he would ask, okay, is it going to continue, and does this pose a problem for humans and the environments we thrive in? If the scientist says yes, or could be, or probably, he'll say, please create a scientific, evidence-driven committee that will suggest possible new policies and projects, actionable things that he can do to protect us and the environments that we need. He's not going to immediately jump on humans as the cause, because he doesn't view humans as fundamentally harmful. He doesn't say environment good, humans bad. He says humans good, environment enriching, or humans good if they're with the environment, right? If it turns out that something we're doing is causing a problem and the science shows it, he'll try and make those tough decisions. So there's no problem between a conservationist viewpoint and addressing massive problems like changes in a planet's atmosphere or climate. And while you might say, oh, really? Would it really work out so perfectly? Well, again, this is a dictator, so it really depends on the guy. But when you look at conservationist organizations, and when you look at how governments administer conservation programs, I'd say it actually comes out quite well. I mean, if you listen to your state's Department of Natural Resources or wildlife authorities, they probably stream on YouTube or something occasionally, or you could go in person. It's all pretty scientific, evidence-driven, and you have a lot of right-wingers who love to hunt and love the environment, and it's different than some people might think if they're watching a lot of crap on television. All right, well, you can kind of guess where my views are. Obviously, I'm not living in a hobbit hole in a Thomas Cole painting, although that's tempting. Personally, I don't have air conditioning. and I heat my house enough in the winter just so the pipes don't freeze. So I've had it where it's just only slightly above freezing temperature in my house pretty much all winter. I need running water for the bathroom. I live too far in town. I don't want to live in some perfectly climate controlled environment. Maybe when it's cold, you should feel it. Our ancestors did. Maybe when it's warm, you should know it. You shouldn't be so completely isolated you don't even know what the weather's like when you wake up in the morning. I mean, think about it like this. If you need to be warm, how about a sweater? Or jump on the couch with your wife or your husband, grab the kids, snuggle up with the dog under a blanket. Heck, if that's not enough, why not grab a hot water bottle? Just something small that provides enough heat for you. You have like a couple, like a man and wife, who are living in a 3,000 square foot house, heating that up in the middle of winter. Let's say they have 10-foot ceilings, just to keep it simple. So instead of snuggling together under a blanket, which might actually, be a little bit more fun and make them happier, instead they're going to heat up 30,000 cubic feet of house to summer temperature in the middle of winter? I know this seems normal today, but to me it seems like extreme waste, extreme decadence, right? To me it's almost obnoxiously wasteful, so over the top. I would almost think that people would be embarrassed of it. But I get it. People aren't, and I'm not saying you have to be. This is where I could also start my tirade on home design and building codes, but I won't. But just like you and anyone else you've ever met, I have a complex worldview. I use NASA footage in some of my videos. I consider the expansion of humans off of Earth to be an imperative. Ultimately, that's not very primitivist. But if someone like me was in charge of making sure humans expand off of Earth, someone with primitivist and traditionalist leanings who is tempted to live in a Thomas Cole paintings, well, what I do might look quite different than if you put someone who idealizes New York City in charge of space colonies and the like.